Welcome. My name is Lauren Webb with the Washington County Historical Society, and today with us is Kent Perkins with the St. George City Leisure Services Department. He's now retired. Today's date is May 5th, 2025. Kent, what is your full name?
Kent Eugene Perkins.
Okay. And when did you become interested in city government?
Well, my first job with the city was in the late 1970s when I worked for the city of Newark, Delaware.
Okay. And what were you doing?
I was the assistant director of Parks and Recreation back then.
Okay. And how long were you there?
5 years.
Okay. And then what made you decide to look elsewhere?
Well, a lot of factors, but my wife was really interested in moving back to the West, where we had actually started. And although I felt like that the opportunities professionally were more in the East Coast, we decided, and another number of other factors, to look to the West. And so we received 3 offers to interview back in Utah, and thought, well, that sounds pretty good, so let's go and interview.
And where were those 3 interviews?
One was in no, it wasn't Magna, it was Kearns. One was the city of Provo, and one was the city of St. George.
Okay. And you took the one in St. George?
I did.
Okay. So when did you decide to apply to work with St. George City Leisure Services Department?
It was in 1982.
Okay. And when did you decide, well, how long did you work there for the department before you became the director? What did you do?
I was the director.
You were the director, so you were hired directly as a director.
I was.
Okay. So
what
made you decide to apply to become the director?
Well, I was an assistant director at the time, and it was a professional upward mobility type of a thing. And so I was given the opportunity to work there or in Provo as another assistant. And I felt like that St. George was on what I call the crest of the wave. And so I determined that this would be a good fit for me and my family.
Okay. What did you see were your duties as City Leisure Services Department?
Well, my first
director?
responsibility was to create a department, because there hadn't been a leisure service department. There had been a number of departments. And so we took the recreation department and the parks department and the cemeteries and the swimming pool and the cultural arts and the old county airport and the golf course, and put them all together into one department.
Wow.
And that was my responsibility.
How many divisions were there? That's
like 5 or 4 or 5.
4 or 5, okay. During your tenure as the director, when did you get the idea to begin the St. George Marathon?
Well, I actually didn't begin the St. George Marathon.
I thought you did.
Well, thank you.
I thought everybody thought that it was you that started the marathon.
The marathon actually started. Sherm Miller came up with the idea of starting a marathon after he'd run a marathon up in Salt Lake City. And so he brought that idea to St. George in 1976.
Okay, and was he working for the department or just?
He was.
Okay.
He was the recreation director at that time.
Okay.
And so I actually started in '82, and so the the race was actually 6 years old.
6 years old. Okay. So tell us a little bit about how it got started.
Well, indicating that Sherm was into running, and he went to Salt Lake City and ran in their 24th of July marathon in Salt Lake City. And he felt like that it would be a good fit for St. George, and so he took the idea back to St. George. I think he even used somewhat the same kind of a name for the marathon at that time. And he went to the Exchange Club and sought some help from them. And the city and the city of St. George and the Exchange Club together decided that they could pull this off. And so the first year, I think they had 43 runners or something like that.
And where was the route? Where did they decide to do the route?
In the city of, or I guess it's a town of Central, up the highway towards Pine Valley is where they started. They actually finished at Bluff Street Park. And a year or two later, maybe even the next year, they determined that that would that needed to be changed. And so they moved the start over to Highway 18 in Central and brought it all the way down
To Worthen Park?
Bluff Street all the way to Worthen Park up 300 South.
Where was the route before? You said it wasn't directly on State Route 18?
They didn't start on 18.
They did not
Started on Pine Valley Road.
They started on Pine Valley Road. Okay.
Yeah, so then they moved it over, brought it down Pine Valley Road, came down into St. George.
Okay. And that's remained the route ever
Well,
since.
in a number of years, as the St. George continued to grow, then Bluff Street became a very busy, as you know, highway or road. And so we changed the route, and I can't tell you for sure what year it was, but we changed the route when Bluff Street came down and got to Diagonal. Then we got off of Bluff Street at that point in time, went down Diagonal, went down 300 West, came over Main Street.
How many years did it stay at that route?
The new route is, after we made that change, it's been forever. I mean, it's the route.
Okay. So what running categories did Sherm Miller and later yourself create, and as the St. George Marathon was being developed?
Well, we did 5-year age categories, the youngest category being 18 and under. Typically, kids less than that, age less than that, we didn't go any smaller. Most races are pretty much 18 and older throughout the United States. So we went as high as there were runners, and so we had people who were in the 80s even running, so 80, 85, 85, 90 type of thing. We also had a category for wheelchairs, and that actually continued until just a few years ago. I think the year or so, 2 years maybe after I retired, they eliminated the wheelchair division, and we had a hand cycle division that we ran for the last few years, but that one is no longer being used.
Okay. What logistical infrastructure was needed prior to holding the marathon during the first Saturday of October? And how did you decide on the date?
Well, the date was set. It became the first Saturday. They looked at this race calendar and determined where there were gaps. It also is LDS conference weekend, and typically that's a travel weekend for St. George. A lot of people come to St. George. And so they just determined that would be the weekend that they wanted to run it. And so it has always stayed as the first Saturday in October.
So tell us a little bit about the logistical infrastructure. What does it take to set up a marathon?
A lot of work. Primarily at the finish line, the starting line. Those are two factors that are major. Over the years at the starting line, with approval of UDOT, my department was able to go in and to improve the site at the start of the race. Initially, it was essentially just the road, and we started on the road, and there was a couple spots you could pull off to the side. But as the race grew, it became incredibly important that we created more of a defined starting area. The first year that I was with the race, they started on the highway, but they had to have restrooms and those kinds of things, and those were back in. Used to be an area where they had it was set up with dumpsters essentially, and it was a dumping area, and there was this circle of dumpsters, and that was the only area that was available for the runners to congregate, which was not particularly positive. And so what we got approval to do was to go into the right-of-way and to clean it up. And so over the years, our department went in and we graded and cleaned and did all kinds of things. One of the first years that the race started, the wheelchairs offloaded their vehicles, and they hadn't gone a couple of miles into the race, and a lot of them got flat tires because of the puncture weed that was along the side of the road. Well, that was not going to work. So we essentially went up and cleaned it up and brought in gravel and graded, and now if you go on site, you'll recognize that that whole area is just one big wide maintains area. We had to go in and we identified locations for the starting line, put in markers, those kinds of things.
And what about, tell us about the buses and the porta potties. I mean, there had to have been a lot of buses and a lot of porta potties.
We used every bus that was available in Washington County, and then we started bringing in buses from Iron County.
Wow.
Porta potty wise, we used every porta john that was available in the entire area. We went clear up into Richfield.
Wow. And didn't at the beginning, didn't they also build fires to keep them warm?
Yeah, and we put bonfires. I don't know how many feet, but we built a long stretch of bonfires for the early morning hours for the runners to stand by.
And then they had some kind of a, I don't know, some kind of a dinner the night before to build up their, I don't know, their protein or whatever the.
Yeah, the old pasta dinner.
Yeah, the pasta dinner.
That went on for years. The Exchange Club was involved with that initially. And then at one time we actually came over to this campus and put on a dinner. In fact, for several years we put on a dinner here at the old student building and one year at the arts. Well, actually it was always at the student building.
Here at Utah Tech.
Utah Tech. But then I think in the last few years the dinner has been eliminated. We moved the entire. Boy, you want me to just go on and on?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. So here's the deal.
Well, it's interesting because a lot of people don't know that history of how it evolved.
So initially, the first dinners were held over at the what used to be a kind of convention center over on the boulevard, and the Exchange Club put on the dinner. Then they moved over, and then we did it here at the Utah Tech, and then. We started having an expo, and so we were underneath the arts building, and we had a few booths set up as our very first expo. And then when the original Dixie Center was built, we ended up moving our expo down there and our dinner down to that location. And we were in a variety of different layouts down at that particular site. And then when the new Dixie Center was built, we ended up moving there and took the entire operation there. And so the night before the race, the entire Dixie Center, for the most part, was set up to accommodate a huge expo, along with dinner and a variety of speakers, et cetera, et cetera. And that has become a very large part of the event. So that whole Friday before, that's where the number distribution takes place. At one time, that people would come to the Arts Center over on Main Street and pick up their numbers, and they'd wander in and get their numbers and wander out at that type of thing. And so we went from that little tiny kind of a setting to where now we have this full scale, set up down at the Dixie Center.
Okay, so tell us about the end. You said there's a lot involved at the end of the race.
Well, a big part of the the marathon is accuracy, and you have to be the exact distance. And so over the years, we've done a number of official measurings of the course. And that's usually done by bicycle, believe it or not. They have a little device called a Jones counter. It sits on the wheels, and you have to ride the race at a certain course a number of times, and then you have to do all these statistical calculations. And but every time the road is widened, every time UDOT does anything to the road of significance, we have to go back and remeasure the course because it has to be exactly the right length. And so over the years, the finish line which is at the Vernon Worthen Park, has done this kind of thing. It's moved from here to here, here, because of those official measurements having to take place when there have been changes to the road. When we change the course, when UDOT changes the width of the course or whatever it might be. And so we finally identified in the last couple of years the course finish line is pretty well set. There's not a lot of change that can happen. Of course, we say that, and then who knows? You don't maybe straighten out a curve or something.
Wow.
But anyway, and at the park itself, you know, it's a huge event. There are thousands of people that attend, and so we have to accommodate that with all of our fencing and all of our bleachers and all of our booths and on and on and on, clothing retrieval, etc.
Okay, so how many volunteers does the department use each year to support the marathon?
Well, it varies from year to year, probably a couple thousand,
And
1,500 to 2,000.
what areas are they involved with? You know, what do they do? What do the volunteers
Well, they
do?
have the aid stations on the course, and every aid station then has a number of individuals that are handing out water and Gatorade and cleaning up the course after the runners, and et cetera, et cetera. There are people at the finish line who hand out medallions, who make sure that runners, if they come across the line and happen to fall or have a problem, they move them into the aid area. The IHC provides that first aid area, and they're volunteers from volunteering for this event. We have people at the starting line who are helping with the setup and cleanup. We have people at the in the park who are handing out water and juice and ice cream and bread and et cetera, who are helping to get the runners all their clothing back to them. We have people, communications people that are volunteers. There's so many volunteers.
How many full-time staff do you have?
All of them.
How many is that? How is it range?
Well, I don't know, having not been there for a few years, the department size,
but when you were there,
we probably had 70 to 80 full-time individuals and a whole bunch of part-time people.
But all of them, all of them were involved.
Yeah. One of the biggest volunteer areas is that we have a delegation coming from Japan, and that's a whole other story. And we have volunteers, people who host them in their homes. And we have interpreters who help us during that process, and they'll go with them and they'll travel around with them around the area and volunteer their time as interpreters.
This takes a lot of coordination. How did that go? How did that develop? What did it take? How many kinds of meetings? Were there a lot of meetings to get this thing going throughout the year, or did you start at a certain time period prior to the marathon? How did that work?
Well, our clock was based on the fact that we have the art festival in the spring, and we have the marathon in the fall.
In the fall.
And besides all the other things that we do, those are the two major events that that draw basically all of our time. And so when the art festival is finished, then immediately we're into planning for the marathon, and when the marathon is finished, immediately we're into the planning for the art festival.
Okay.
But because the marathon became so big that we got to a point where we had staff that were year-round focused on different aspects of it, sponsorships and material acquisition and registration processes and all those other kind of things. And so in many ways, the marathon is kind of a year-round thing. The art festival's not quite there yet as far as year-round, but it takes up 9 months or 10 months or something like that.
Okay, so what have been some standout marathons? Any that just were really
Well, out of the
there?
34 I was involved with,
34.
I had a hard time picturing. The first one was a standout because it was my first one, and when I got to the start, I realized that it was raining like crazy, and we had very few lights to light the area, and so it was kind of a holy cow, what do we got going here? You know, we can't see each other. The rain is pouring down. The runners had found huge sheets of plastic And I don't know, maybe they brought them with them or whatever it might be. And so they looked like a 1,000-legged centipede or something, because they would hold the plastic up above them. And even as they were running the first while, underneath this giant sheets of plastic.
Oh, wow.
We had very few porta-johns available. We didn't have any lights. We had a megaphone, and that was pretty much it. And we had a guest starter, and it was Fulmer, the boxer.
Mm-hmm.
And I had taught him how to start a race. Told him to hold the gun out here, and he held it right here.
Oh, no.
And
It hurt his ears.
well, he said it's no worse than laying on a mat when the bell, the end of a round,
Yeah.
ding, Anyway, that first year was fraught with all kinds of issues, the rain and et cetera. We had a plastic tarp over the computer at the finish line, and the water would run down and drop onto people.
Oh.
It was
wow.
pretty crazy. Obviously, we improved from then on out. The next one that stands out to me was we had the National Masters Championships. We were the only community of our size to ever host a National Masters Championships. And the race went very well, and it was a kind of a breakthrough for St. George. The next one was when Boston was celebrating its, I think, 100th birthday, if I remember right. And they decided that they were going to do something special, so they opened it up to a lot more runners. And so we decided, because a lot of our runners qualified on our course to go to Boston. So we tried to do a few extra special things, and Runner's World, the largest running magazine in the world, contacted us and said, we know that you guys are a fast course, that a lot of runners are going to come to St. George to qualify for Boston. So we'd like to send all of our editors over, and what we'll do is we'll create a pacing team, and we'll help runners reach their qualification standards. And so they sent like a dozen editors from their magazine over.
Wow.
Each one of them took a different time, and if you and had a flag, and if you ran with that runner, your odds were very good that you would be able to qualify in your age group for Boston. Well, they did a major article on us in Runner's World, and our numbers went pew.
Wow.
And they loved it. The fun thing about them is the town was full, and there weren't that many
Motels,
or whatever. And when they finally notified us, everything was full. And so we ended up putting them up in the third floor of the hospital that was doing renovation, and it hadn't opened yet. And so they gave us permission to be able to sleep people.
Is this over on River Road
No,
or
the
on
old-
400
the old
East?
hospital.
The old hospital.
And so we had people, they were in hospital beds.
Oh my gosh.
That
Wow.
that was memorable for them.
That's definitely memorable.
Yeah, that was a great year, and because it went really well, we got a lot of national notoriety. And so from then on out, we became one of the hot races to get into, and it became such a difficult thing to get into our race because we had to set a cap, because we couldn't accommodate people. We couldn't
What
accommodate
was
with
that
the
cap?
buses.
Was it 6,000 or
Well, every year it
5,000?
changed.
Every change.
Every
year
time
it
we built
changed.
a new motel, we changed the cap.
Okay.
In fact, my very first year, we had created a cap because we called it the philosophy of bigness. And basically we determined that we couldn't run a race effectively and efficiently if we were bigger than we could accommodate. That makes sense, I guess.
Yeah.
So we calculated how many hotel rooms we had and how many buses, whatever, and we set a cap. And we hit our cap and had to shut it off at 2007. 2,207 was our cap. And and we were kind of growing incrementally until that Runner's World magazine article. And then it went through the roof. And we would close the registration in one day. People would drive from California and be
in one day.
in one day. We tried a lottery system with the big old lottery barrel, and that became, and people would send envelopes with funny drawings on them and little flags and things. Please select me, that kind of thing. And so that was not sustainable, and so we decided we needed to come up with some other way, and we set a deadline, and it started filling up, like I said, in one day. People would drive from Southern California to St. George to be here on the morning that it opened to make sure that people would get in, and people from Alabama and Arkansas and Georgia and Florida would yell and scream and say, your deadline is this date, but there's no way we can get our stuff in faster than anybody else. So then we came up with all kinds of different ways to get people in that was more fair, because we were growing so fast and that people wanted to get in so quickly.
Where was it when you finally retired? When did you retire?
In 2017.
Okay, so that year, what was the cap? Approximately, if you remember.
It was 75 or 82 or something like that.
7,500, 8,200?
Yeah, one year we set the cap at something like 7,000, and we had over 10,000 entries.
Oh, wow. So tell us just a little bit about the media coverage. You've already talked about Runner's World. I guess you've had all kinds of media coverage, right?
Well, yeah, we had a lot. The radio,
and international.
Obviously, the radio, the Spectrum. The Spectrum was at one point was there and always did the results, and there was really good coverage back in the day.
Do you get that kind of coverage with St. George News now on all the individual
Well, I
listings?
really don't know. Not the same kind of coverage.
Okay.
But, we used to get full-page spreads, but there was a time when KUTV out of Salt Lake City did live coverage and actually brought cameras down, and et cetera. And there's a story that goes with that. One year when they were doing live coverage, they had a kind of a boom on their truck.
Mm-hmm.
And they were following the lead woman runner, and she was way ahead of the national best time, and they thought she was going to set a national record, which she ended up doing. And she somehow, that boom or whatever it was, hit a power line, and the line hit the ground in front of her and sparked, and she had to dodge the line, or that electric, whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
And she said that's probably part of the reason why I set the record, because I had to get through there so fast.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, they did live coverage for a while, and then they backed off, and then so we really haven't had any live coverage for years.
Okay. Where does the St. George Marathon rank nationally?
Right now it's number 20 in terms of the number of finishers.
Okay. You've already talked about pretty much about the changes that were made at Worthen Park, right, to accommodate. I noticed that eventually they were able to put a cement walkway all the way around the park. They didn't have that for many years.
Right.
Right? Okay. Anything else that stands out about Worthen Park?
Well, we put in the new gazebo there in the center of the park, and that became a site for our awards category,
Okay.
which was really nice. And
Okay.
of course, there's a lot of changes at the park, but most of them don't relate specifically to the marathon.
Okay. Where was the St. George Leisure Services Department originally housed? And how has that changed over the years?
Oh boy. Well, the parts of the department, the recreation and the parks, were housed in the old swimming pool building, and parks was down in the basement. And that's a place you don't want to go, or didn't want to go, but that's where they were. And recreation was up above in the old pool building. Cultural arts was over in the art center. And then the other, facilities had their own sites. But So my first office actually was in what is now the utility office, or the HR office actually.
Where was that?
That was up at City Hall.
Okay.
And then we moved down after doing some renovation, moved down to the recreation, or to the art center, the old Dixie High building.
Yeah, the Dixie Academy building. So you were at 175 North, 200 East at one point, and then you moved down to the Dixie Academy building. Okay.
And that's where we stayed until, I don't know, about 10 years ago or something. And then we moved up to, and we renovated the old Commons building, which is the old county courthouse.
The Hall of Justice
State
building?
Courthouse. The Hall of Justice.
The Hall of Justice building.
Yeah, and we renovated that
Okay.
facility, and then Leisure Services moved into that building.
Okay, across the street from the current city offices. Okay.
Yeah, and Leisure Service, by the way, is no longer called Leisure Services.
What is it called now?
Parks and Community Services.
Parks and Community Services. Okay. Tell us about the City Parks and Recreation Department, and who had the vision to create the large number of city parks as well as the network of city trails?
Well, that department and Leisure Service Department are one and the same, right?
Right.
Okay, so back in the early 80s, a land planner by the name of Ira Hodges and myself spent a lot. He came from the East Coast, and so did I. Well, actually from the same area. He was in Delaware at the same time I was there. I didn't know him at the time, but before we left, somebody said, "You ought to look up Ira Hodges. I think he moved to St. George." And so when we got here, I looked him up and found out that he and I had a lot in common, and so we spent a lot of time. And our favorite thing was to walk around the community and to, as he said, wave our hands and talk about the things that could be. And having been on the East Coast, in more established cities, we recognized that there was tremendous potential in St. George for a lot of things. And so we decided that maybe we got to kind of put all of our dreams on paper. And so we talked a lot about what could be, and so things like the trail system, park system. And then we started looking at the area and said, there are things here that are really important that we don't want to lose, things that draw people to St. George. And so we called that the critical areas. And those are the rivers and the hillsides and the other things, wetlands and stuff. Then we talked about beautification. And what could be done to beautify the community, et cetera, et cetera. And we put together 5 or 6 different master plans. And then we went to the city manager and presented all of our ideas. And he suggested that we put them all together into one plan. And so we called it the Critical Areas Plan. And out of that Critical Areas Plan then was created a Critical Areas Plan Committee and a Hillside Committee. And out of that Hillside Committee became the Hillside Review Board, and the intent and all of the regulations that go to protect our hillsides. And then out of the Critical Areas Plan then were the idea that we would try to protect and preserve all of the river corridors in the community and a lot of other sensitive areas. And from that initial thing came the master plan for the trail system, for the park system, for the beautification program, which included the shade tree program, all the beautification of the entryways into the city, all the landscaping that you see and all the rights of ways, the landscape program that is implemented through the planning department, for all the new development, et cetera, and all of the major right-of-ways.
How many city parks do we have, and how many miles of trail?
Well,
approximately.
I think the trails are up into the 70s or 80s miles. Parks, when I retired, we were at 40 something or other, and I think we're probably pushing 50 right now.
Okay. Tell us about the city swimming pool, the Sand Hollow Aquatic Center, and the history of the pools within the department, Leisure Services Department, or what do they call it? The Parks and Community
Services. Yeah.
Community Services Department.
So the original city pool was in Worthen Park, and called City Park at that time, and was there for I don't know how many years. And then in 1974, the city applied for a land and water conservation grant, a federal grant, and they were able to get enough money to be able to build the pool down on 700 South. And a couple of years later, a entrepreneur came to the city and offered to work a deal with the city where they'd put in the tube slide, and that I'm not exactly sure when that was. The end of the 70s, I believe. And so the tube slide was instituted down on 700 South, and as you know, that's still there. And over the years, there haven't been a lot of changes in that facility. It's pretty much, I know they've done some upgrading this year, et cetera, but, and then in 1996, the city passed the Parks and Recreation bond. And that's a whole other story. But the bond became the major funding source for the majority of the big facilities that the city has today. And so the Sand Hall Aquatic Center was one of the facilities that the public asked for. And so that design took place, and I think we opened, it was either 1999 or 2000, somewhere in that neighborhood, when the pool was, when the aquatic center was open. The facility was designed by a group out of Denver who've done facilities all over the United States.
Okay. Describe the St. George sports program and the sports that the city sponsors.
Okay, well, that's always been one of the hallmarks of the department, with youth sports and adult sports. And of course, they've expanded into a number of other kinds of sports. At one time, we had the largest soccer program in the whole area, and then private groups came in and started offering soccer, and travel teams and et cetera, and that kind of shrunk the city's soccer program, but it's still there. So that's soccer, baseball, softball, t-ball, volleyball.
You mentioned tennis, right?
Rugby, tennis. Anyway, those are youth programs, adult programs. They have pretty much the same: flag football, futsal, kickball, anything pretty much with ball.
Yeah. Okay.
Pretty much. The city's programs now expanded because of initially we built the Tonnequin Tennis Complex, and then of course pickleball became the king, and so then that became a major thrust, would be the pickleball throughout the facility, the community,
including Little Valley.
Oh, Little Valley and Bloomington and city downtown, and
yeah,
there are other places around town where it's planned, I know.
Right. Describe the Tonnequin Nature Center and how that appeals to a different set of recreation.
Okay, so obviously, as a part of the bond, we determined that we not only had to build facilities, but we need to have land to build facilities. And so we entered into a land acquisition program, and we purchased quite a few acres of property for what is now called Tonnequin Park, but also the Tonnequin Cemetery, the Nature Center, and Thunder Junction. That was all one big piece of property. And the driving force on that particular site was the Tonnequin Nature Center, because it was such a beautiful site, and it was a wetland, and et cetera, et cetera. So we acquired the property and then began to develop the Nature Center, and we got a small grant to be able to do that, and built the pond, et cetera. The Nature Center, in and of itself, was the idea that we wanted to preserve. That's one of the preservation areas within the community that we thought was significant. And nature, I was involved with nature centers back on the East Coast, 3 or 4 different nature centers that we operated. Very popular, very attractive to people who are typically not just sports oriented, but it creates a whole different way of not only preserving a special area, but creating programming that allows access to the outdoors, camps and
right.
unique kinds of settings there. And so the Nature Center has become just a really nice thing. The biggest thing that happened negatively to the Nature Center was the big flood back in the 2000s, early 2000s. And a big chunk of the nature center actually disappeared, thanks to the river taking out a lot. But our parks people have gone in over the years and reforested that area significantly. And
It's
so
a beautiful, beautiful place,
yeah,
beautiful area.
And it's really nice.
So tell us about the Zion Square. Not very many people really know about that, but it's kind of a nice little jewel in downtown.
Well, it was a function of working with Zion National Bank. And the idea was to create a beautification right in the heart of the city. And so we entered into an agreement with them that we would maintain that if they would make the space available.
Okay.
And so that's what it is, essentially. It's a beautiful little thing, and we put sculpture in there now.
Okay. Were you the originator of the Recreation, Arts, and Parks tax that has helped various organizations provide, the various recreation and cultural arts opportunities for city residents?
I wasn't the originator, but there were a number of communities in the state of Utah and other places that created RAP taxes. And so there were several of us that talked about, and this would be an ideal funding source.
So tell us about the benefits.
Well, primarily, recreation, arts, and parks. And for the first time, the arts was able to receive funding through a taxing program, which is really nice in a sense, because the majority of the funds that come to the RAP tax come from sales of, it's 0.1% or something like that. And so when you think about it, because we're such a tourist-oriented community, then you've got money coming in from thanking people who come here and spend their money,
Right.
are helping us be able to develop our own programs and facilities. And so it's a very small increment of money, but it turns out to be a really large benefit for creating recreation, but primarily for facilities on the recreation and park side. But then on the arts side, it creates an opportunity to support the arts
Okay.
in the community. And so the cultural arts gets a real bang for that buck. That we
Okay.
get.
Tell us about the other city-sponsored events such as the St. George Arts Festival, and what involvement have you had in that particular event and maybe any others?
Well, the Arts Festival was 2 years old when I moved to St. George. And first year was held at the Ancestor Square. And then the next year it moved to the street, on Main Street. And so for a number of years we were on Main Street, and we grew from 1 block to 2 blocks, and then it became too big. And so that's when Town Square was built. And so once Town Square was ready for us, we moved into Town Square.
And you've had plenty of room and lots of booth patrons. I mean, I was just blown away. I mean, I spent, probably a good hour going through almost every one of the booths, and I still didn't get through all of them.
Well, it was well into the 100 and something 80s or something like that. Booths. For years, it was about 110 artists. It's bigger now, but there's thousands and thousands of people that come to
Right.
to the city for the art festival, and it's been a great joy to see it grow and the quality of the artists, et cetera.
So are there any other major accomplishments that you feel were made during your tenure as director of St. George Leisure Services Department?
So getting out my horn so I can blow it, is that what you're asking me to do? Well, yes. For instance, our trail system is probably one of the ones that I'm most pleased with. Thunder Junction, All Abilities Park, right at the top. Great opportunity to provide access to people of all abilities, and it's growing, and they're going to add to it this year. Safety Town, a little program we started back in 1982, teaching preschool kids and kindergarten kids about safety in life. It's gone on now for 40-something years.
That's amazing.
And
Yeah.
it was harder to get into than the marathon was for the most part. We converted the old armory into the recreation center. which I think was a real win and had been a real blessing for this community. I think preservation we've acquired a lot of land and preserved a lot of land along the rivers, which has been another thing that we've really been really pleased with. We built and run a beautiful museum, art museum.
Right.
And that whole renovation of the town, of that square up there, you know, there were a lot of people involved in that process, but being able to have a museum over the years, it's a beautiful, beautiful facility.
Okay.
I just happened to make a note.
Okay.
When you asked that question, I thought, you know, the critical areas plan, I think, was one of the best things. And then, of course, the bond election of '96, which thankfully has been renewed now.
Yeah.
But that bond election brought the Canyon Complex, softball complex, the tennis courts, the aquatic center, the recreation center, second phase, the skateboard park, you know, a half a dozen neighborhood parks and a lot of trails. So it was
Wow.
really a great blessing. The last one that I'll tell you though is in 2015, our department was recognized as the outstanding department in the United States.
Wow. That's
Called
amazing.
it the Gold Medal Award by our
Wow.
National Parks and Recreation Association. So we were pretty happy about that.
Yeah, that's awesome. What other civic or religious organizations have you participated in, if any?
Well, with the LDS Church, I'm involved in a lot of things there. I think notably, though, Special Needs Mutual. Have you ever heard of Special Needs Mutual?
No, but it sounds really neat.
Well, initially we had 23 stakes or units feeding kids with special needs into this program, and it started out quite small, and before the end of the first year we had over 100 and something individuals participating, and at the end of the first year it was so big that we had to split, and we split for Washington, Hurricane, and 2 on the other side of town, and so that program has grown from one program to 5 programs and probably 400 or 500 participants.
Wow.
Every Thursday for years now, and I think that's one of my favorite and all-time things. I'm also involved with the Virgin River Land Preservation Association, which is an organization that I helped found, which is a land preservation group, which is, I haven't been actively involved with it for a number of years. I'm back now involved with it, but those individuals have helped preserve millions of acres and thousands of acres of property, which is really great for the community.
Wow.
I was also involved with the St. George Live History program back that Doug Alder created.
Yes, I remember.
And where we dressed up like
Yes.
individuals, and I was one of the Pratt brothers, Orson Pratt,
Orson Pratt.
and welcomed people to historic buildings downtown, which was a lot of fun.
That is a lot of fun.
That was a
Yeah.
great organization, and
Wow.
that's, I mean, it
Okay.
goes on and on, but
So,
the
go ahead.
senior games.
and the World Senior Games
Yes,
too.
and I direct the road races in the senior games, and that's
That's awesome.
that's part of it.
Yeah. Okay. So where and when were you born?
I was born in Ogden, Utah in 1948.
Okay. And who else was in your family?
At the time, Mom and Dad.
Okay. You were
Yeah.
the oldest. You were the oldest?
I was
No other children?
no. Oh, I have 2 siblings.
Okay. Were you the
two
oldest?
sibling brothers and a sister.
Okay.
And I am
were
the
you,
oldest.
You were the oldest. Okay.
Still am the oldest.
Okay. What did your community look like outside of your family?
Community?
Your community. What did Ogden look like when you grew up? What was it like?
I don't know. I was too young.
Oh, okay.
My family moved I actually lived in Layton.
Okay.
I lived in a World War II housing development that for all those returning
Okay.
GIs. And
Okay.
we lived there for a few years and then moved to Cheyenne, Wyoming.
Okay. Where did your ancestors come from?
over the pond. So I have from England and a little bit of Germany, Scotland, a little Ireland, for the most part.
Okay. Where did you first settle?
Where did they or me?
Where did they first settle? Excuse me.
Okay, so I have a number of ancestors who were at Plymouth Colony, came over on the Mayflower.
Wow.
Tennessee, Maryland. I have the Perkins ancestor was an indentured servant who came over to Maryland, and from Maryland they went to North Carolina and South Carolina and Tennessee, and then over to Illinois.
Wow.
And on the Gaddis side, we're from Tennessee and that area, and
Okay.
Colorado, and
Describe your grammar school and your high school years.
I was small.
You were small. Oh,
So-
where did you go? What
Cheyenne,
school did you
Wyoming.
attend?
I went to two different elementary schools and a junior high and a high school, Cheyenne East High School.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, did you have any interest in your school days? Did anything stand out at that
That was
time?
really boring. I didn't want to. No.
No sports.
I
no.
was an art guy.
Okay.
I was in arts, and every sport that came down.
Okay.
In my neighborhood, I was known as the guy in charge because I organized a neighborhood football team and a baseball team and a basketball team, and we didn't really have a parks department or recreation department, so our neighborhoods played each other, and so I was in charge of that. I organized a track meet, had a sports equipment lending service. I created a neighborhood newsletter. I did all those things as a neighborhood kind of a guy back in the day, and so that's what I organized the parties when I got older.
Wow. What influential teachers did you have? Anyone that stood out?
Mr. Bittinger, he was a history teacher.
Okay.
I enjoy history, so he was really influential in the early days of.
Okay. What were your hobbies and interests as a child?
Rocks,
Rocks.
Indian artifacts, arrowheads, and whatever. Sports. I was sports. I could tell you the names of every starting lineup in baseball back at one time.
Okay.
So I was really into sports.
Did you collect baseball cards?
Absolutely,
Okay. Any favorites?
all of them.
Okay. Education-wise.
I once had 300 doubles, and I traded them for a turtle.
Wow.
Turtle ran away the next day, and I lost my cards and my turtle.
No. Education-wise, did you attend college or university, and what was your major and
So
minor?
I went to BYU. I was a art major for 2 years.
Okay.
Graduated with a degree in broadcasting and communications
What year?
in 73.
Okay.
I think it was. And in 74, I went back to school and I got a master's degree in recreation, education, and administration.
Okay. How did you decide to go there?
Where?
To BYU. What made you decide to go to BYU?
I was actually accepted at Weber State. And I don't know why I didn't apply for BYU, but I had a friend who came back from BYU and touted how great it was. So I decided to apply, and miraculously they let me in. They wouldn't today with my grades, but miraculously I got in.
Okay. And did you have any influential mentors there at BYU?
Yes,
Any that stand out?
a lot of them, but the people who were in charge of the advertising program were extraordinary, and their classes were very hard. And I learned that being in a hard class was not a bad thing, that it stretched you, and actually you could learn at a higher rate.
It's true.
And then when I went into the master's program, John Hansen was one of the professors, and he was down to earth, really good guy, and he was really a powerful influence on me. But Gary Palmer, who was a professor there, was really powerful. And one of the reasons why I was on the East Coast to work was because Gary Palmer had said that when he graduated from the university, he didn't have any job offers except for one in, I think it was Illinois, and one in North Carolina. So he packed up his family and he drove to those two to assess them, and ended up in North Carolina or something. And so at the time I graduated, it was slim pickings, and my wife and I looked and called, my phone bill was extraordinary back then, called every major city west of Denver, Colorado to the coast, and couldn't find anything that was even offered. And so I packed up my family, put them in a car, and drove east, and stopped at every major city on Highway 80 all the way across, and walked in on and asked people for employment. We got to New Jersey. My wife's family lived in New Jersey. I went up and down the coast. I even drove 300 miles for a part-time interview. Didn't get it. But eventually I started working in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And
Wow.
then in Delaware, and then we came back to the West.
Okay, so describe how you met and married your spouse.
She lived right next door to me at BYU.
And what's her name?
Her name is Lynn.
Last
And
name?
She was a Haycock.
Okay.
And she and I were in what they called the BYU family group, family home evening group, and together. And that's where we met. And we got married a year after, a little over a year and a half after I met her, I guess. Married her in Salt Lake City at the Salt Lake LDS Temple.
Okay. Describe any important aspects of your family life and raising your children. Do you have children?
You don't have that much time. I have 5 boys and 1 girl.
Any grandchildren?
19.
Any great-grandchildren?
None.
None. Okay.
My kids are scattered all over. I have a son who works for Disney down in California. I have a son who's in Nevada. I have a son who works for Meta, for Facebook, in Utah County. I have a son who is the chief of staff for the Alpine School District. I have a daughter who lives in Mapleton, and I have a son who lives here.
A son who lives here. So you've got one child that lives here that you can go see on a regular basis. Okay. As you look back over your life, what would you like to be remembered for?
Well, that's an excellent question. You knew that was an excellent question, because it would take me forever to come up with an answer. Well, I always want to think that we raised a good family, and that they're God-fearing, that they contribute to their communities, that they're good people. Obviously, that would be right at the top. I really think it's important that we recognize that there is no greatness without goodness in this life. And to be great, to be good, basically is to be the best you can be. And so if you're kind and generous and helpful and supportive and those kinds of things, that certainly would be something to be remembered for. And so I think there's been a lot of good done in the community, and I've been pleased to be a part of a lot of that goodness. And I hope that, there are some things that we've done that were really good, with the department, but there's more to it than just, I'm happy with what we've left from St. George. I think that my goal was to do my best to help St. George be better than when I got there, to contribute in some way and to be a contributor. And so I feel like we've been a contributor to help make the community something special. Okay. There are those who would yell at me and say, "You're the reason why why there's too much traffic. Because the things you created, helped create, brought too many people to St. George. I've heard that, believe it or not. Well, I didn't create anything, but I was a part of the process and helped make some wonderful things happen in St. George. So I think, you know, some have said that I kind of I've been a visionary. Well, maybe I have, you know, and it hasn't stopped with retirement. You know, I can see lots of things that are good, but besides seeing what's good in the community, you know, you hope you can see what's good in people.
Yeah, and I think many people would see you as a true visionary for seeing what this city could become. You know, with all the many offerings that it has, that it's become a destination community. Is there anything else that you feel is important that I haven't asked you?
Good to see you. I'm glad I still recognize you from the time when you were just a little nipper working at the Spectrum.
I know, it's really good to see you. I've always admired you, and yeah, I you know, as a reporter, I got to come in contact with you often, you know, and I have always had a great deal of respect for you. So at this time,
I have one more thing to tell you that I'm proud of.
Okay.
I have great taste in wives.
Okay.
She's an extraordinary lady, and so I want to be remembered for my good taste.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So we want to thank all of you for joining in with us for this oral history interview. We want to, at this point, we want to thank the Community Education Channel Studios. We want to thank Lauren Golden and her staff for providing this service. And we look forward to joining with us again the next time we have an interview. This is our 19th interview, oral history interview, that I have been involved with. So I'm really grateful for that opportunity. And until we see you again, thank you so much.